Agatha has always considered herself a woman with an iron will. At the age of 78, she had lived an eventful life and believed that nothing could surprise her anymore. The marriage with her husband lasted for more than 40 years until he passed away 10 years ago. After his death, she was left alone in a large house with 100 memories, an old garden, and photographs on the shelves. She was proud to have raised 2 daughters and seen them become mothers themselves. But now, alone, old age was slowly engulfing her like a fog, creeping into all corners of her mind. Every year her life became more measured and routine. Her grandson Kai sometimes came to her, helped with the house and garden. He was a kind young man, always attentive and caring, despite the fact that his own life was full of events. At the age of 25, Kai was a successful photographer who traveled a lot and rarely stayed in one place. Agatha loved him. He was her joy and comfort, the last ray of light in a life that had long lost all its colors. But everything changed one summer when Kai came for a few weeks to help with the garden and repair the old house. At first, Agatha did not pay attention to the small changes that were happening to her feelings. She blamed it on age, on longing for the past, on loneliness. She had always loved Kai as a grandson, admired him, and was proud of his successes. But this time, something was different. She felt it in his presence, a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness that she couldn't explain. Her heart began to beat faster when he entered the room, and her hands trembled slightly as she prepared food for him. One evening, when Kai was helping her in the kitchen, something changed. Time seemed to slow down. His hand accidentally touched hers as he passed her a vegetable slicer. Agatha froze for a moment, but there was something unusual about this touch. Something warm, almost gentle, slipped through her fingers like an electric charge coursing through her entire body. She pulled her hand away, feeling strangely agitated. It was stupid. It wasn't normal. She is a grandmother, and he is her grandson. How could such thoughts even occur to her? But they came, and they stayed. Told the next day, she found herself staring at him for a long time while he was working in the garden. His strong hands, his confident movements, his smile as he brushed his hair off his face. Everything about him seemed perfect to her. Agatha had never seen him like this before. She tried to convince herself that it was just maternal pride, that she was rejoicing at his success and youth. But something dark began to settle in her heart. Every evening, when they sat at the table and discussed his projects and travels, she felt it more and more. This strange, inexplicable thrill that made her feel like she hadn't felt in years. She noticed that she began to pay more attention to her appearance. Despite her thoughts went back to her youth, to the days when she was beautiful and desirable. These thoughts deepened as she looked at Kai.
What's going on with me?
Agatha thought, standing at the mirror and looking at her wrinkles, which now seemed especially deep to her. She tried to push those thoughts away. She was ashamed. She knew it was wrong. How could a woman her age have such feelings for her own grandson? But every morning, when she saw his smiling face as he hugged her before breakfast, that strange excitement would come back again. One night, she woke up in a cold sweat. She had a dream that she couldn't get out of her head. In this dream, Kai was not just her grandson. He was her lover. In this dream, they walked together through the sunlit garden, holding hands, and everything seemed so right. He kissed her, and she felt young again. When she woke up, her heart was beating as if she had just experienced something real. But it was just a dream, a ridiculous, wrong dream. Nevertheless, this dream haunted her. Throughout the day, her thoughts kept coming back to him. She tried to distract herself by immersing herself in household chores, but nothing helped. Questions began to form in her mind that she was afraid to look for answers to. She tried not to look at Kai for too long, but every time he was around, her thoughts became hazy. Agatha began to avoid him. She was ashamed of the thoughts that were settling in her head. Every time he came to her with questions or helped her around the house, she felt her heart begin to beat faster. Her own body betrayed her. Her mind betrayed her. She tried to keep her distance, but it was useless. He was too close. His presence affected her too much. But one evening, after a long day, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Kai talked about his recent trips, shared stories about the people he met. His voice was calm and confident as always, but Agatha didn't hear the words anymore. She looked at him, at his face, at his eyes, and something inside her broke. She couldn't deny what she was feeling anymore. It was like a curse. She, an old woman, fell in love with her own grandson. She didn't even know how this could happen. It was abnormal, immoral, absurd. But her heart wouldn't listen to her mind. Every time she saw him, her heart skipped a beat. Every time he touched her hand, she felt this strange thrill. And although she understood that these feelings should not have been allowed, they became stronger every day. She began to feel like a prisoner of her own emotions. It became difficult for her to look at Kai. It was difficult to be near him, but it was even more difficult to be away from him. She was torn apart between common sense and this crazy feeling that gripped her. Agatha tried to find an explanation, trying to convince herself that this was just the fruit of her senile loneliness, but none of the explanations calmed her down. Every day her condition became more and more unbearable. Her thoughts about Kai became more and more intrusive. She could no longer find peace day or night. She began to realize that her attraction to him was no longer just a strange feeling. It was a real love, such as she had felt many years ago for her husband. Her mind was full of images of Kai, his smile, his touch. She tried to deal with it, but every time they were alone, her self-control began to crack. Agatha woke up early in the morning, when the first rays of the sun were just beginning to break through the curtains of her bedroom. It was cool in the room, and the silence was so dense that it could almost be felt. But there was no peace or peace inside her. Instead, her mind was filled with thoughts that she was afraid to admit. The dream in which she saw Kai did not leave her alone. These images seemed to haunt her even in reality. She got out of bed and put on a bathrobe, trying to distract herself. Kai was still sleeping in the next room, unaware of the storm that was raging in her head. Agatha knew that this was not normal, that her thoughts were going against the natural order of things. She was ashamed of herself. Every day she spent with him, her feelings only intensified, and it terrified her.
I'm an old woman,
She thought, standing in front of the bathroom mirror. Her wrinkled face and grey hair reminded her of who she really was. She had lived a long life, and had long ago come to terms with the fact that love and passion were no longer part of her reality. But now these feelings, which she had thought long buried, awoke in her, like some old demon that had been dormant in the depths of her soul for a long time. She tried to convince herself that all this was just the fruit of her loneliness. She's getting old. Loneliness, longing, memories of youth. All this can make a person feel something strange. It's just physiological, senile. After all, she had lived alone for a long time, and now that Kai had appeared in her life, he had become an anchor for her in this ocean of emptiness. It was her only way to explain what was happening, and although she searched for rational explanations, they did not bring relief. That day, like many others, she and Kai decided to spend time in the garden, pruning bushes and removing old leaves. Kai joked, telling her about his trips and funny moments from his life. Agatha tried to focus on his words, but her attention kept returning to how he looked. His hands, tanned by the sun, moved confidently and deftly as he worked. His smile was warm, sincere, and every little thing reminded her of his youth and strength. She tried to fight these thoughts, to push them away. It was impossible, wrong, immoral. She felt disgusted with herself for allowing herself to think of him in that light. He's her grandson. But her mind betrayed her, returning to these strange, forbidden fantasies over and over again. One evening, after a long day of gardening, they were sitting in the kitchen. Agatha cooked dinner, and they ate in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts. Kai seemed to be completely calm, unaware of the demons tormenting her from the inside. He talked about his plans for the future, about new projects he wanted to start, and that he would have to leave again soon. Agatha listened to him, but her thoughts were far away. She tried not to think about what would happen when he left. Maybe his absence would make it easier for her to fight with herself. After dinner, Kai stood up and thanked her for the meal. His words were ordinary, without a hint of anything unusual. But when he touched her hand to say goodbye before going to his room, the gesture was like lightning. Agatha felt her heart stop and then begin to pound wildly in her chest. He did not notice how her hand trembled, and with a slight smile he left. Agatha sat at the table, not moving, feeling everything inside her turn over. She couldn't deny the truth anymore. What she felt was not just the fruit of loneliness or longing for youth. It was something bigger, deeper, and it scared her to the core. Every day she realized more and more that her attraction to Kai would not disappear by itself. She tried to avoid him, to shorten the time they spent together, but it was all in vain. When he was around, her heart beat faster, and her thoughts became confused. When he was away on his own business, she missed him. She began to realize that she was thinking about him even when he wasn't around. One night, unable to cope with her obsessive thoughts, she went outside. The sky was covered with stars, and the moon softly illuminated the garden. Agatha walked slowly along the path, trying to calm her agitated mind. One seemed to split into two parts. One part told her that this was not normal, that she had to fight with herself, that these feelings would destroy everything she had. But another part, the one that had recently awakened, whispered to her that this feeling could not be ignored so easily. Her struggle with herself was becoming more and more unbearable. At one point, she stopped at an old bench in the garden and sat down on it, burying her face in her hands. She tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. It was too much. She couldn't handle it alone anymore, but at the same time, she couldn't tell anyone how she felt. She was trapped by her own emotions and didn't know how to get out of this trap. The next morning, as usual, Kai went to her kitchen where Agatha was preparing breakfast. He was in a good mood, smiling, joking. But Agatha felt like a stranger in her own home. She felt like she couldn't look at him the same way anymore. His every look, every gesture made her shrink inwardly from conflicting feelings. She decided to distract herself by pretending that everything was as usual. Her tone was even, as it always was when she talked to him, but there was a storm raging inside. She knew she couldn't show him her feelings. It will destroy their relationship. It will destroy her as a person, as a grandmother, as a woman. She could never let Kai know what was going on in her head, but this confession was like a bolt from the blue. She didn't want it. She tried to fight, but her heart betrayed her. Now that the truth stood before her in all its ruthlessness, she had to think about what to do next. She knew she would never be able to reveal her feelings to him, but it was becoming more and more difficult to live with this secret. Every day with him was a torment for her. Every look at his face made her feel pain and guilt. Her struggle with herself had reached its climax. She realized that it was impossible to continue living like this, but she did not know how to find a way out. She hoped that Kai would leave soon, and then his absence would help her cope with these feelings, give herself time to forget about them. But even that did not bring her comfort. Agatha continued to struggle with herself, knowing that her life would never be the same again. Agatha understood that this feeling was growing inside her like a disease, and although she knew that she should never open up to Kai, the fear of her own feelings became her constant companion. After long days of internal struggle and sleepless nights, Agatha sank more and more into the abyss of her feelings. One day, as she sat by the kitchen window, watching the dawn in the garden gently spread its golden blanket over the blooming flower beds, she noticed the first of many signs that would later begin to fill her mind. She couldn't call it something explicit or obvious, but her thoughts suddenly sounded in her head.
This is a sign. It's fate.
At first, she dismissed the idea as a silly obsession, but then something inside her crackled and stirred. Like a long-dormant animal, Zitay watched that day Kai had to leave for the city on business, and Agatha was left alone in the big house. Her loneliness, usually oppressive and suffocating, seemed strangely comforting this time. She walked around the house, trying to distract herself with ordinary things, but every little thing reminded her of Kai. The book he'd left on the living room table, his jacket carelessly thrown over the back of an armchair, his cup left on the kitchen table, everything spoke of him. And every detail seemed important to her, significant, like pieces of a mosaic that add up to one whole picture. During the morning cleaning, she accidentally stumbled upon an old photo album, which she had long ago thrown into the depths of the closet. She didn't remember why she took it out the last time, but today, for some reason, she wanted to open it. Agatha sat down on the sofa and began flipping through the yellowed pages. In each photo, she saw her family, herself, her husband, her daughters. But when she turned the page and saw a picture of Kai, a little boy with a big smile and a shock of brown hair, her heart sank again. It was her grandson, her blood. But why did she see him differently now? Through this strange feeling, the thought arose in Agatha's head.
Maybe it's not just like that.
She tried to brush it off, but the image of Kai wouldn't let her go. It seemed that the world around her began to adjust to her thoughts. Even the photograph she held in her hand seemed to her not just a part of the past, but a kind of symbol confirming her feelings. As the days went on, Kai returned home less and less often. Agatha felt a growing uneasiness, as if her connection with him was fading like a candle in the wind. And yet, despite his absence, she continued to see the signs. One of them happened a few days after that accidental discovery with the photo album. Agatha went out into the garden in the morning to water the flowers. The sky was clear, and a light breeze brought the smells of summer. As she walked along the path, her gaze fell on an old oak tree growing at the end of the garden. This oak has always been a symbol of strength and perseverance for her. But today she noticed something strange. There was an old inscription carved on one of its trunks that she hadn't noticed before. N.A.K. Agatha's heart began to beat faster. It was like a lightning strike.
Agatha and Kai.
She thought. She came closer to examine the inscription. It was probably carved by someone many years ago, but in her head it seemed like something fateful.
Maybe it's a sign.
A thought flashed through my mind. She looked at this carved inscription over and over again, as if she wanted to find hidden meaning in it. Was it really a prediction that had been waiting for her to notice it all this time? Despite her rationality, Agatha couldn't stop thinking about it. She saw such signs around her more and more often. Her mind turned every little thing into something special. The way the candle flame flickered once in the direction where Kai was sitting, as the sun setting over the horizon, threw its last rays on his face. It seemed to her that the world itself was trying to tell her something important that she had ignored for too long. One night she woke up to the fact that she had another strange dream. In this dream, she was standing in front of a mirror in her wedding dress. There were guests around her, and Kai was standing next to her, dressed in an elegant suit. The dream was so real that when she opened her eyes, her heart was still racing and her breathing was uneven. She ran her hand over her forehead, feeling cold sweat. It was just a dream. But why did it seem so real? Why was she seeing this now? When her thoughts were increasingly returning to Kai, she lay in the dark for a long time, trying to figure out what it all meant. Her inner world began to split into two parts. One part screamed that this was crazy, that she had to stop before she went too far. Another part convinced her that all these were signs of fate, that her feelings for Kai were not accidental, that perhaps they were destined by life itself. Over time, Agatha began to attach more and more importance to these signs. She took every incident, every detail as confirmation that her feelings for Kai were not a mistake, but something more. She began to believe that fate was leading her down this path. Even then, when Kai returned after a long absence and thanked her once again for her care and easy conversations, her heart told her that there was something more behind his words. One evening, when Kai was sitting in the living room again, flipping through a book, and Agatha was making tea in the kitchen, she noticed something on the wall that made her stop. It was an old painting that depicted a couple sitting on the porch of a country house. There was love and calmness on their faces. Agatha suddenly realized that the man in the painting reminded her of Kai, and the woman reminded her of a younger version of herself. It seemed like another sign to her. She froze, not knowing how to react to this. It was strange and implausible, but her mind began to put all these signs together. Now everything around her seemed to be part of some great mosaic. In every gesture of Kai, in every word, in every random event, she saw confirmation that her feelings were not a mistake. The certainty grew in her mind that she had to act, that fate itself was telling her what to do. Her inner voice, which had once tried to dissuade her, was now barely audible in the hum of her own thoughts about destiny. Agatha could no longer ignore these signs. They were everywhere. She even began to notice them in small things, in the way raindrops fell on the window forming symbols, or how the moonlight illuminated one part of the house where Kai was sitting. All this created in her head the feeling that the universe was sending her its messages. One evening, when they were sitting on the porch, Kai was telling her about his future plans, and Agatha, looking at him, saw something in his face again, something that she thought she hadn't noticed before. This was another sign that couldn't be ignored, and although she knew that her feelings contradicted all logic and morality, her consciousness now firmly convinced her that all this was predetermined. Her struggle with herself continued, but now it was getting harder to deny the obvious. Agatha stood at the window, watching Kai work in the garden. Summer had come into its own, and the midday sun flooded the site with bright light. His figure moved confidently and calmly, as always. Youth, strength, agility, everything about him seemed perfect, and every step he took seemed to confirm what she had long ago decided for herself. Their bond was more than just a family bond. She no longer doubted that all those signs that she saw around her were an indication that fate was leading her on the right path. The inner voice that had been insistently whispering to her that this was madness was now almost silent. Every step she took towards Kai was now dictated by something more than just desire. It was a duty to herself, to that new, awakened woman who was hiding inside her. She began her attempts at rapprochement with the little things. At first, it was just an extension of the time they spent together. She found excuses to be with him more often. For example, that evening, when he was working at the site, she went out into the garden, ostensibly to water the flowers, but in fact her hands were clutching a hose with water, just so that she could surreptitiously watch him. She was standing nearby, and his every gesture caused her a strange excitement. Her heart skipped a beat when, unaware of her gaze, he raised his head to the sky, brushed his hair from his face, or bent down to the ground to grab something. She could feel the feeling that she had been suppressing for so long burning up inside her. The next day, Agatha decided to cook his favorite dish, something that Kai had adored since childhood. She spent several hours in the kitchen, lovingly cooking everything, trying to make everything perfect. Her hands were shaking as she cut vegetables and watched the pots, but this excitement was not from fatigue. It was from the fact that she was cooking not just a meal, but a gesture. It was the beginning of her journey towards getting closer to him. She was looking for any opportunity to show him her concern, and this was her first attempt. The dish was ready. Agatha, with a tremor in her heart, served it on the table. She watched Kai enjoying his meal without saying a word. He was smiling, and his smile was like a reward for her. Her heart fluttered with joy when he ate, not even suspecting that all this had a hidden meaning for her. Every bite he took seemed to her to be proof that she was moving in the right direction. In her mind, it wasn't just a family dinner. It was the first link in a chain of events that she believed would lead them to something more. Devotion, but it wasn't enough. The inner fire that was burning in her demanded more. She began to find new reasons to be closer to him all the time. She offered to help him in the garden, even when he politely tried to refuse. Her hands involuntarily reached out to his as she handed him the tools, her fingers lingering on his arm a little longer than necessary. They were small, almost imperceptible gestures, but to her, they were full of meaning. She longed to feel his closeness, that fleeting contact that told her more than any words. Agatha began to pay attention to how Kai spends his time in the house. He liked to sit in the living room in the evenings, immersed in his books or laptop, doing his projects. She used to leave him alone, believing that he had his own life and his own interests. But now she was attracted to him with such force that she could no longer stay away. She came into the room under the pretext of something insignificant, to pour herself tea, to straighten the cushions on the sofa. But in fact, she just wanted to be there. She sat nearby, pretending to read a newspaper or embroider, but her thoughts were only about every time he was in the room. Her presence became more and more noticeable. She could feel the invisible bond she had instilled between them. It was a game of silence that only she played. She searched his eyes, watched the way he moved, the way he breathed. Sometimes it seemed to her that he too felt something unusual, that he too noticed her presence. But Kai remained calm, immersed in his own affairs, unaware that a real storm was going on in her heart. Every day her desire to get closer to him became more and more obvious to herself. Agatha began to notice how her own actions were becoming more and more intrusive. As they walked through the garden, she began to slow down, trying to walk closer to him. Her hand sometimes accidentally touched his arm as they walked side by side. They were subtle gestures, but each one was like a new attempt for her to overcome the barrier that existed between them. She wanted him to notice her, to see her differently. But at the same time, she was afraid that he would understand everything that was going on in her head. Her attempts to get closer to Kai also included more and more small gifts. She began to give him things that she thought should remind him of her. These were small but significant things for her: books in which she left her notes in the margins, objects that reminded her of her youth. These gifts were a way for her to strengthen their bond, to make it more tangible. She also began to pay attention to his appearance. Every time he came back from the street, she noticed how his skin glistened in the sun, how his hair was slightly disheveled by the wind. She felt strangely excited when he came to dinner dressed in his usual casual clothes. But to her, it looked like he was deliberately trying to impress her. Everything was forming a logical chain in her head. All these moments, gestures, glances, these were signs that told her that he might also feel something special. But despite all her attempts, despite all the moments she was trying to create, there was still an invisible wall between them. Kai remained unchanged, kind and caring, but he still saw her as his grandma. This feeling of disappointment gradually began to penetrate her soul, but Agatha did not give up. She kept trying, kept looking for new ways to be closer to him. One evening, she decided to arrange something special for him. She remembered how many years ago, when she was young, her husband would arrange romantic candlelit dinners for her. These memories gave her an idea. She decided to recreate something similar for Kai. She spent the whole day cooking a special dinner, placing candles all over the house, creating an atmosphere that she thought was supposed to show him her true feelings. When Kai returned home tired after a long day, he was surprised by what he saw. The house was lit by soft candlelight, and the dishes she had prepared for him were already on the table. Agatha was sitting at the table, trembling in her heart, waiting for him to join her. This dinner was supposed to be the culmination of all her efforts, her attempt to show him how she felt. But something went wrong. Despite all her efforts, Kai remained the same as always. He thanked her for dinner and smiled, but there was nothing in his eyes that she had hoped to see. He saw in this gesture only a manifestation of her care, her love as a grandmother, and not as a woman. This moment was a crushing blow for her. She put her whole soul and all her feelings into this dinner, but Kai did not notice anything that went beyond the usual care. Agatha felt her world crumbling. All the signs she had seen before, all her attempts to get closer to him, seemed pointless to her now. Agatha was sitting in her room with her head in her hands. Her whole world seemed about to collapse. After the dinner she had arranged for Kai, the hopes she had been building collapsed with a bang, leaving her alone with a painful feeling of emptiness. She knew that something had gone wrong, that despite all her efforts, Kai still saw her only as a grandmother, and this realization burned her like poison, spreading through her veins and turning her dreams into pain. The days have passed since the ill-fated dinner. Agatha watched Kai, trying to catch the slightest hint of a change in his behavior, but everything was the same. Kai remained as kind, caring and attentive as ever. He spent time with her, helped her around the house, but there was the same intangible wall between them that destroyed her dreams. She tried to convince herself that it was just a misunderstanding, that he needed time to process her feelings, but deep down she knew that Kai couldn't feel for her the way she felt. Her mind, already exhausted by the struggle with her own thoughts, began to be burdened by this constant tension. Every time they were in the same room together, it seemed to her that the air around her was compressed, making her breathing heavy and unbearable. She tried to suppress this feeling, but it was getting stronger every day. Her inner voice, which had been whispering to her for so long about destiny and the signs of fate, now sounded with renewed vigor. He kept telling her that she had to act, that there's no point in procrastinating anymore. Her heart sank every time she looked at Kai. Her feelings, which had previously seemed strong but hidden to her, were now like a volcano about to erupt. She couldn't fight it anymore. The idea arose in her mind that the only way out was to open up to him, admit her feelings, put everything on the line. The thought terrified her, but at the same time gave her hope that it would finally free her from the yoke she had worn for so long. Maybe he'll understand, she thought. Maybe he'll see me differently. And one evening, when the sun was already setting, Agatha made a decision. This day was the culmination of all her thoughts, fears, and desires. She knew she couldn't hide her feelings anymore. If she didn't do it now, she would forever remain a prisoner of her unfulfilled fantasies. She could no longer live in the shadow of these emotions. Kai was in the living room, going about his business as usual. His gaze was focused on the laptop screen, but Agatha saw something defiantly familiar in his calmness. Her heart started beating faster when she entered the room. She took a few steps towards him, feeling her legs grow heavy and her body tense. The air in the room seemed thick and heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had compressed around her, making it difficult to breathe. She stood not far from him, in silence. Kai, not noticing her presence, continued to work, but her silence became so palpable that he finally raised his head and looked at her. Agatha felt something break inside her. Her gaze met his, and at that moment she realized that she could no longer remain silent. All those feelings that she had suppressed for so long were now bursting out, filling her mind, her heart, her body. Without saying a word, she took a step toward him, slowly and carefully, as if she was afraid to scare away reality itself. Kai looked at her with mild bewilderment, not understanding what was going on. He was used to seeing her calm, caring, but now there was something strange in her eyes, something he hadn't expected. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached him, and her breathing became uneven. She paused for a moment as if gathering her strength, and then at that moment, she reached out and touched his shoulder. It wasn't just a touch, it was a recognition embodied in a gesture. Her fingers slowly slid over his arm, as if she was trying to convey all her feelings to him through one touch. In her mind, the gesture seemed important and deep to her, like a bridge between them. She couldn't hide her emotions anymore. It was her only way to express all that she was experiencing. Kai froze. His gaze became more serious. He didn't understand what was going on, but there was tension in his eyes. He sensed something strange in her gesture, but he couldn't figure out what it was. 1,000 thoughts flashed through his mind, but none of them were close to what was actually going on in Agatha's head. She continued to stand in front of him silently, but her inner world was engulfed by a storm. Her hands were now slowly moving towards his face, as if she was trying to keep in contact with him for as long as possible. There was pleading, desire, fear in her eyes, all mixed up into one huge feeling that she could no longer contain. She hoped that he would feel it, that he would understand her without words. It was her moment of truth, but Kai suddenly retreated. His face turned pale and his eyes widened. He felt something wrong in her touch. He tried to pull away, but she held out her hand to him again, as if she was afraid she would lose this moment if he moved too far away. The silence in the room became unbearable. She hung in the air like a thick blanket that made it difficult to breathe. Agatha knew that something had gone wrong. His withdrawal, his reaction, all indicated that her hopes were being dashed. She didn't know how to react to his backward movement, to his cold gaze. Her heart clenched in the grip of fear and despair, but she didn't stop. Her hands were shaking as she tried to touch him again. The same voice kept ringing in her head, telling her that it was all right, that this was her chance. She couldn't let it end like this. But Kai took another step back. His expression had changed. There was not just bewilderment in it now, but something else as well. Something deeper. Shock. He turned abruptly and left the room, leaving Agatha standing where she was. She didn't move. Her body seemed to turn to stone. She knew that all was lost. All her efforts, all the signs she believed in, turned out to be just an illusion. Kai didn't understand her. He didn't feel what she was trying to convey to him. The room was plunged into a dead silence. Agatha stood there, feeling her heart slowly cool down. The moment she'd been dreading and waiting for at the same time had passed, but instead of relief she felt only emptiness. Her hopes were shattered, her fantasies crumbled to dust. The silence in the house was thick, like a woolen blanket that pressed down on every space. All those feelings that filled Agatha have now disappeared, leaving only emptiness and powerlessness. Her attempt to confess her feelings, her last desperate steps to get closer to Kai, all failed. He left without saying a word, leaving her alone in this cold room, where every object, every corner now reminded her of the pain and shame she felt. Agatha slowly sank into a chair, her hands trembling, as did her whole body. The sudden realization of what she had done came to her with devastating force. Her inner world, which had seemed so stable despite all the madness, was now falling apart. All those signs, all those moments that she took for predestined, turned out to be just her fantasies, created by her mind, which could no longer distinguish between reality and illusion. Her heart was beating slowly and heavily, as if every pulse was giving off pain all over her body. She tried to figure out what had happened, but her thoughts were tangled like threads that had come together in one tight ball. She couldn't believe that she had gone so far as to allow herself to believe something so absurd. Her life, her existence, seemed meaningless to her now. Agatha couldn't sleep that night. Her head was filled with thoughts of Kai, of how he must have looked at her with horror and incomprehension. She no longer saw in front of her the grandson she had once loved as her own. Now all that remained of their relationship was overshadowed by her own crazy feelings, and the thought was killing her from the inside out. Kai, meanwhile, wandered around the house, avoiding rooms where Agatha might be. After her touch, after he felt that something deeply wrong had happened, he couldn't stay in her presence. It seemed to him that the air in the house had become heavy, suffocating. Every detail, every little thing now reminded him of what had happened. It was hard for him to breathe, hard for him to think. He couldn't understand how this could happen. Everything that seemed so simple and clear before has now become complicated, confusing and terrifying. He sat in his room trying to collect his thoughts. His gaze was fixed on the wall, but his mind was far beyond the room. Agatha, his grandmother, a woman he had known all his life, a woman who always took care of him and was an example of love and kindness for him. She was someone else to him now. He felt like he couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Her touch, her looks. Now it all seemed alien and frightening to him. He couldn't stay here. This thought was as clear as any other. Kai realized that he had to leave. The sooner the better. He could no longer be near Agatha. Her presence caused him anxiety that he could not overcome. He needed to leave, to sort himself out, to figure out how to move on after all this. Early in the morning, when the house was still asleep, Kai began to pack his things. He moved silently, trying not to make any noise so as not to wake Agatha. He knew that if their eyes met again, he would not be able to bear it. He quickly packed his things, leaving only those items in the house that no longer mattered to him. Every single thing he touched now seemed to be imbued with a strange energy left over from that evening. He had to leave this place, otherwise he wouldn't be able to breathe. Agatha, although she did not see his actions, felt that something was changing. She hadn't slept all night, and her thoughts were racing between fear and despair. She knew that Kai would not be able to forgive her. She realized that their relationship would never be the same again. It was her own fault. She had taken the first step towards destroying what had once bound them, and now all was lost. When Kai left the house, Agatha went to the window and saw his departing figure. He walked at a brisk pace, with a bag over his shoulder, without looking back. She watched him, feeling her heart clench with pain. She wanted to say something, wanted to stop him, but she couldn't. Her voice was suppressed inside her. Her body was as if paralyzed. She knew this was the end of everything they had. Kai reached the car, got into it and drove away. The house fell silent again, and this silence was the last blow for Agatha. Now she was all alone. Kai left, and with him went her last hope that things might be different. Now she understood that her feelings were an illusion caused by loneliness and longing for the past. She had let her emotions take over her mind, and now she was paying the price. Days passed, and then weeks. Agatha could no longer enjoy the silence in the house. Every corner of this house reminded her of Kai, of those moments that she considered important, but which, in fact, were just a figment of her imagination. Her life turned into an endless cycle of repetitions. She got up in the morning, cooked herself a modest breakfast, then sat in an armchair by the window, watching the garden, which had seemed alive to her before, but now became empty and lifeless. Her mind kept returning to thoughts about what was wrong in her life. She thought for a long time about her youth, about what she had lost, about how her life was trapped in loneliness and despair. She tried to find answers, but she couldn't find them. All she had left was a painful sense of loss. Her health began to deteriorate. She rarely left the house. Her strength was fading every day. She didn't see the point of her existence anymore. Kai didn't contact her anymore, and she understood that. She understood that he had left forever, never to return. He was the last thread that connected her to life, but now it's broken too. One morning, Agatha just didn't wake up. The sun rose over her house again as it always did, but she didn't see it anymore. Her heart stopped in silence, like her whole life, leaving behind only the memories of what she could never fix. In the golden warmth of the late afternoon, the sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields of the village. The air was thick with the earthy scent of dry grass, and the distant hum of insects filled the stillness. The village of Ngele, nestled near the vast African savanna, seemed at peace, caught between the rhythm of nature and the slow movement of time itself. Life here moved in tune with the land, each day marked by the sun's passage across the sky, each season by the rains and the harvest. Kofi, a 25-year-old artist, walked along a well-worn dirt path, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tattered pants. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat, and his bare feet kicked up dust as he moved. The young man had been feeling unwell for a few days now, a persistent ache gnawing at him, slowing his steps and clouding his mind. He had tried to brush it off, but the discomfort lingered, settling deep within him, making it hard to concentrate on his work. Kofi had always been a man of few words, preferring to express himself through the brushstrokes he meticulously applied to the canvases he fashioned from whatever materials he could find. The world around him was his muse, the vibrant colors of the savannah, the graceful movement of animals, and the quiet strength of the people in his village. His art was an escape, a way to communicate what he felt, but could not articulate. But today, even the solace of his painting seemed out of reach. He had heard about Amina before. Everyone in the village had. The older woman, in her 60s, lived on the outskirts of the settlement, in a small, modest hut, surrounded by a garden of medicinal plants. She was known for her healing abilities, her knowledge of herbs passed down through generations. People came to her for remedies when the local clinic couldn't provide answers, trusting her with their ailments, both physical and emotional. Her reputation as a healer was matched only by the respect she commanded for her wisdom. Amina was not just a healer. She was a woman who had lived through the full cycle of life. Her face, though lined with age, still carried a quiet beauty, the remnants of a once striking woman who had seen much of the world and its challenges. Her eyes, dark and thoughtful, held the weight of experience, and her hands, though aged and calloused from years of labor, moved with the precision of someone who knew the delicate balance of life and death, health and sickness. Kofi had never spoken to her before, but today, driven by a quiet desperation, he found himself walking toward her home. The path led him through tall grasses and past fields where children played, their laughter distant and dreamlike in his fevered state. The sound of the wind brushing against the trees accompanied his steps, providing a rhythmic backdrop to his journey. As he neared Amina's hut, he noticed the way her garden flourished. Bright, vibrant greens mixed with the occasional bloom of small, delicate flowers. The garden seemed to radiate life, an extension of Amina herself, grounded and steady, deeply rooted in the earth. He paused for a moment at the edge of the clearing, unsure of how to approach her. The air around her home felt different, charged with a quiet energy that made him feel both nervous and comforted at the same time. Gathering his courage, Kofi stepped forward, his feet making soft impressions in the dry earth. As he approached, he saw Amina seated on a low stool beneath the shade of a broad acacia tree, her hands working skillfully to grind leaves in a small wooden mortar. She didn't look up at first, her focus entirely on the task before her. The rhythm of her hands, steady and deliberate, seemed to mirror the heartbeat of the earth itself. Kofi cleared his throat, the sound barely louder than a whisper. He wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from someone like Amina. His pride held him back, but his growing discomfort pushed him forward. After a long pause, he spoke.
I need something for the pain.
Kofi said, his voice barely above a murmur. Amina lifted her head slowly, her gaze resting on him for a moment before she set down her work. She studied him in silence, her dark eyes moving over him with the careful assessment of someone who had seen countless others stand before her, each carrying their own burdens. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency. Time, it seemed, bent differently in her presence. She nodded once, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, and then rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. Without a word, Amina disappeared into her hut, leaving Kofi standing there under the tree, unsure of what to do with himself. The wind stirred again, rustling the leaves, and for a moment, Kofi felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as though the world had quieted in anticipation of something. When Amina returned, she carried a small clay bowl filled with a mixture of herbs and roots, the earthy scent of the remedy mingling with the breeze. She handed it to him without explanation, her eyes meeting his as she did so. There was something unspoken in that gaze, a recognition of his need that went beyond physical pain. She seemed to see something deeper, something he hadn't fully acknowledged himself. Kofi took the bowl, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest of moments. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through him, a strange and unexpected spark. He quickly looked away, focusing on the remedy in his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. Amina, however, remained still, her expression unchanged, as though she had not noticed the moment at all.
"You'll feel better by tomorrow,"
she said quietly, her voice smooth and calm, like the wind through the trees. Kofi nodded, his throat tight, and turned to leave, but something made him hesitate. He glanced back at Amina, standing there beneath the acacia tree, her presence as solid and grounding as the earth beneath his feet. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite place. A strength, a wisdom that seemed to draw him in. He opened his mouth to speak, to thank her, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded again and continued on his way. As he walked back along the path, the bowl of herbs cradled carefully in his hands, Kofi couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He'd come to Amina in search of relief, but he left with something more, a quiet sense of connection that lingered long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The days in Ngala village stretched lazily as the dry season continued, the sun bearing down relentlessly on the golden savannah. Life moved at its usual slow pace, but for Kofi, something had shifted. After his visit to Amina's hut, he found himself thinking about the older woman more than he expected. He couldn't explain it, but something about their brief encounter had left an impression on him. The feeling was subtle at first, like a quiet hum in the back of his mind, but it grew stronger with each passing day. His health had improved as Amina had promised. The remedy she had given him worked swiftly, and by the next morning the dull ache that had plagued him for days had lifted. But even as his body healed, Kofi found himself drawn to Amina's small home at the edge of the village. He started with an excuse. He needed more herbs, or so he told himself, but soon it became something else entirely. His visits grew more frequent, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the calmness that surrounded her, or the way she seemed to carry the wisdom of a lifetime in her quiet movements, or maybe it was simply that she listened, truly listened, something Kofi had not experienced in a long time. Amina didn't question his growing presence. She accepted it as naturally as she did the changing seasons, never asking why he came, nor offering more than what he needed in the moment. Her life was one of quiet routine, tending to her garden and her remedies, greeting the occasional villager who sought her help. She wasn't used to company, but there was something about Kofi's presence that didn't disturb her solitude. In fact, it was the opposite. His silent companionship brought a new rhythm to her days, one that she found she didn't mind. The bond between them grew in small, almost imperceptible ways. At first, Kofi would simply sit under the acacia tree while Amina worked, watching as her hands skillfully ground leaves, mixed potions, or tied bundles of dried herbs. He observed the way she moved, with a kind of grace and deliberation that seemed to come from years of practice. There was no rush in her actions, no wasted energy, only purpose. The days turned into weeks, and Kofi began to feel more at ease in her presence. He brought his sketchbook on his visits, though he rarely drew. Instead, he found himself captivated by the quietness of the space around Amina's home, by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the buzzing of insects, and the faint scent of the herbs that hung in the air. It was a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the village, and Kofi found a kind of peace there that he hadn't realized he needed. Amina, for her part, continued her work without comment. Occasionally, she would glance at Kofi, her eyes filled with an unreadable expression, as though she were trying to understand something about him. She'd seen many people come and go from her life, but Kofi was different. He was young, and yet there was an old soul inside him, a quiet depth that intrigued her. She sensed his need for something beyond healing, a kind of solace that went deeper than the body. One afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the savannah, Kofi sat under the tree, sketching absent-mindedly. His pencil moved across the paper, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He was trying to capture something of Amina's essence, the way she seemed to merge with the earth, her presence as natural as the plants she tended. His hand hesitated, unsure of how to convey the feeling that lingered in the air around her. Without a word, Amina appeared beside him, carrying a cup of herbal tea. She handed it to him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she returned to her work. Kofi took the cup with a nod, the warmth of the tea seeping into his fingers. It wasn't the first time she had done this. Their exchanges were brief, but meaningful in their simplicity. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. As he sipped the tea, his gaze wandered to the plants growing in neat rows around Amina's hut. He had never asked her about her work, but now curiosity tugged at him.
What is this one for?
He asked, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. He gestured toward a plant with broad, waxy leaves that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Amina glanced up from her mortar and pestle, following his gaze. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, one of the few expressions she allowed to break through her usual calm.
Fever,
She said simply, her voice low and smooth. Kofi nodded, though he already knew the answer. The question hadn't really been about the plant, but about breaking the silence between them, a way to start a conversation that might lead somewhere deeper. But Amina didn't seem inclined to elaborate, and Kofi didn't press her. Instead, he returned to his sketching, content in the quiet understanding that had grown between them. The seasons began to change, the dry heat giving way to cooler winds as the first rains approached. With each passing day, Kofi found more reasons to visit Amina. Sometimes he brought her small gifts, an interesting stone he had found, or a flower from the fields. She accepted them without fanfare, placing them carefully among her other treasures. In return, she would hand him a cup of tea, or a new herb to try, though she never explained their purposes. It wasn't necessary. Their actions spoke for them, a language all their own. One evening, after a particularly heavy rainstorm, Kofi arrived at Amina's hut soaked through, his clothes clinging to his skin and his hair plastered to his forehead. The rain had caught him off guard while he was out collecting firewood, and instead of heading home, he had found his feet carrying him to Amina's. When she opened the door, she raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping aside to let him in. Inside, the air was warm, the scent of dried herbs hanging thickly in the room. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Kofi stood awkwardly for a moment, dripping onto the floor, before Amina handed him a towel and motioned for him to sit by the fire. He did as she instructed, grateful for the warmth. As he sat there watching the flames dance, he realized how natural this had all become. His presence in her home, her quiet acceptance of him. They sat in companionable silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. After a while, Amina rose from her seat and began preparing a bowl of something fragrant, the smell of spices filling the small space. She placed the bowl in front of Kofi, her expression as unreadable as ever.
eat.
She said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a gentle command. Kofi hesitated for a moment before taking the spoon. The warmth of the food spread through him, a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. They didn't speak as he ate, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only comes with a deepening bond, one that doesn't require words to be understood. As the weeks turned into months, their friendship grew stronger. Kofi continued to visit Amina, and each time, he felt the invisible threads of connection between them tighten. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. Their friendship was built on the simple acts of presence, of shared space, and quiet understanding. In Amina, Kofi found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. Someone who saw him not just as a young man with potential, but as a person with depth, with unspoken needs and desires. And in Kofi, Amina found a companion who respected her solitude, who didn't ask for more than she was willing to give, but who, in his quiet way, offered her the companionship she had long thought she no longer needed. Together, they shared the slow unfolding of life in the village, their friendship growing like the plants in Amina's garden. Quiet, steady, and resilient, the seasons shifted slowly, and with them the bond between Kofi and Amina grew in ways neither of them had expected. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a quiet, steady unfolding, like a seed taking root beneath the soil, unseen until it burst through the surface, tender and fragile, but undeniably alive. Their friendship, once grounded in mutual respect and understanding, had deepened into something more profound, something neither of them had anticipated nor fully understood. The village of Nagala was small, and as with all small places, whispers traveled quickly. At first, no one paid much attention to Kofi's visits to Amina. He was a young man, an artist, known for his introspective nature. Amina was an elder, respected for her wisdom and healing. It was not unusual for people to seek her out for remedies or advice. But as the weeks turned into months, people began to notice the frequency of his visits, and soon, the whispers began. Kofi had never cared much for village gossip. He had always been somewhat of an outsider, more at home with his sketchbook and his paints than with the chatter of the marketplace or the banter of his peers. But now, for the first time, he found himself the subject of that gossip. He could feel the weight of it in the air whenever he walked through the village. Curious glances, quiet snickers, and the occasional knowing look from those who thought they understood more than they did. It wasn't long before the whispers found their way to his family. Kofi lived with his mother, a strong-willed woman who had raised him alone after his father's death many years before. She was proud of her son, even if she didn't always understand his quiet, introspective nature. But when the rumors reached her ears, she grew concerned. She called Kofi into their small home one evening, her face lined with worry.
Kofi,
She said softly, her voice gentle but firm. People are talking. He knew what she meant, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue.
They say you've been spending a lot of time with Amina.
There was a pause, and then she added,
More than is proper.
Kofi felt a tightness in his chest. He had anticipated this conversation, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure how to respond. He had never spoken about his feelings for Amina, not even to himself. But now, faced with his mother's concern, he realized there was no avoiding it any longer.
She's my friend.
He said simply, his voice calm but unconvincing even to his own ears. His mother's brow furrowed, her eyes searching his face. She knew her son well, and she could sense that there was more to his words than he was admitting.
Kofi, she began carefully. Amina is much older than you. She's lived her life. You're just starting yours. People are saying things that
She hesitated, then sighed.
they don't understand, and they're judging.
Kofi remained silent, his heart heavy. He knew his mother was trying to protect him, but her words felt like a slow tightening around something fragile inside him, something he hadn't yet allowed to fully bloom. His feelings for Amina were complicated, layered with admiration, respect, and something deeper, something he hadn't expected to find with someone so different from him, in both age and life experience. But love doesn't always follow the paths we think it should. It doesn't always grow in the places we expect. The tension between Kofi and his mother simmered quietly in the days that followed. He continued his visits to Amina, but with each one, he could feel the weight of the village's judgment pressing down on him. People stopped him in the streets, their eyes lingering a little too long, their questions thinly veiled beneath polite smiles. One afternoon, as Kofi made his way to Amina's hut, he passed a group of young men from the village. They were sitting in the shade of a large tree, talking loudly and laughing. As Kofi approached, their voices dropped, and he could feel their eyes on him. "Trying to see your old woman again, Kofi," one of them called out, a mocking tone in his voice. The words stung sharper than Kofi had expected. He didn't respond, keeping his gaze fixed ahead, but his pace quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. The laughter followed him down the path, a bitter echo that clung to him long after he was out of earshot. By the time he reached Amina's hut, the sky had begun to darken, heavy clouds rolling in from the horizon. The air was thick with the promise of rain, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves in the trees. Kofi stood outside the small house for a moment, collecting himself before knocking on the door. Amina opened it with her usual quiet grace, her dark eyes taking him in without a word. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his jaw was set. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting him in. The inside of the hut was warm, the scent of herbs and dried flowers filling the air. Kofi sat down in his usual spot by the fire, his mind still buzzing with the cruel words of the young men. Amina moved about the room, tending to her work, but after a while, she paused and looked at him.
"They're talking,"
she said quietly, her voice like the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Kofi didn't respond immediately. He knew Amina wasn't asking for confirmation. She was simply stating a fact. She'd lived long enough to understand how people worked, how gossip spread like wildfire in small villages like theirs. She'd probably known this would happen before Kofi had even realized it himself. After a long silence, Kofi finally spoke.
"I don't care,"
he said, though the weight in his voice betrayed the lie. Amina didn't respond. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, waiting for him to find the words he couldn't quite form.
"I don't care what they think,"
he repeated, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Amina moved toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. She sat down beside him, her presence as calming as the warmth of the fire. She didn't touch him, but her nearness was enough to steady the storm brewing inside him.
"You should care.
She said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience.
Not about their words, but about the choices you make."
Kofi looked at her then, really looked at her. There was no judgment in her eyes, no anger, just a quiet understanding, a knowing that came from living a life full of choices, some easy, some hard. She had faced her own share of whispers, of judgment, and she had survived them all, but she knew the cost. "I don't regret anything," Kofi said after a while, his voice quiet but firm. Amina smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. It was a smile that held both sadness and acceptance, a smile that said she understood him better than he understood himself. She had lived long enough to know that love, real love, was never easy. It didn't follow the rules. It didn't care about age or circumstance, but it also didn't exist in a vacuum. It lived in the world, and the world was a harsh place, full of people who didn't understand, who couldn't see beyond their own narrow views. For weeks, the village's gossip continued to swirl around them, a constant, unrelenting force. Kofi and Amina did their best to ignore it, but it was impossible to escape completely. Wherever they went, eyes followed them, judging, questioning. Friends became distant. Acquaintances stopped speaking to them. The once welcoming village had become a place of whispers and cold stares. Through it all, their bond only deepened. The adversity they faced brought them closer, strengthening the quiet connection they shared. They didn't need to speak of it. They both knew the challenges they faced. Amina, with her years of wisdom, understood the world's judgment better than Kofi did. She had lived through enough to know that love, especially love that defied expectations, was always met with resistance. And yet they persisted. Each time Kofi came to Amina's hut, they found solace in each other's presence. They shared meals in silence, their conversations now a mixture of words and unspoken understanding. Sometimes, they simply sat together watching the fire crackle, feeling the warmth between them that no one else could touch or tarnish. Their love, though tested by the world outside, remained pure and strong. It was a love that had grown not in spite of the odds, but because of them. It was a love that defied the conventions of age, of expectation, and of judgment. It was theirs, and no one could take that from them. As the first rains of the season fell, drumming softly on the roof of Amina's hut, Kofi sat beside her, their hands resting close but not touching, the weight of the world outside momentarily forgotten. In the quiet, they knew that no matter what came next, they had each other, and that was enough. The sun over Ngala hung lower in the sky as the dry season drew closer to its end, but the heat of the village's judgment felt unrelenting. What had begun as whispers had now become a constant presence in the lives of Kofi and Amina, an invisible wall closing in on them from all sides. But judgment lingered in every corner, in every glance, in every interaction, or lack of one. It was the silent force that shaped their days, whether they acknowledged it or not. For Amina, the judgment was something familiar, something she had experienced in different forms over her long life. As a woman who had lived alone for many years, she was no stranger to village gossip. People had always talked about her choice to live outside the main settlement, about her healing practices that many respected but some secretly feared, about her independence in a world where women of her age were expected to be grandmothers or the quiet heads of families, not solitary figures working with roots and potions. But this time, the whispers cut deeper. This time, it was not just about her. It was about Kofi. Amina could feel the tension every time Kofi arrived at her hut, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He tried to hide it, tried to pretend the gossip didn't affect him. But she could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the slight hesitation before he spoke, in the way his gaze sometimes flickered to the ground before meeting hers. He was carrying a burden she knew all too well, the burden of being misunderstood. In the village, the judgment was palpable, though it rarely took the form of outright confrontation. Instead, it was quieter, subtler, but no less painful. Kofi felt it in the spaces between words, in the awkward pauses during conversations with his neighbors. People who had once been friendly now avoided his eyes, their greetings colder, more distant. The marketplace, once a vibrant space where he could linger and watch the world pass by, had become a place of hushed tones and side glances. It was as if the village itself had shifted, tilting slightly against him, making everything just a little harder, a little more strained. One afternoon, Kofi went to the marketplace to buy supplies, just a few simple items: reese, millet, and some vegetables. He moved through the stalls as he always had, keeping his head down, focusing on the task at hand. But as he approached the vendor he usually bought from, an older woman with kind eyes, he noticed a change. She avoided his gaze, busying herself with rearranging the items on her table, her movement suddenly stiff and mechanical. Kofi hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, offering a small, tentative smile.
I'll take some rice,
He said softly, his voice carrying more uncertainty than he intended. The woman didn't respond immediately. She kept her hands busy, pretending to examine a basket of grain. The pause stretched uncomfortably between them, a silence heavy with unspoken words. When she finally looked up, her expression was distant, almost cold. Without saying anything, she measured out the rice, placed it in a small bag, and handed it to him without meeting his eyes. The exchange was quick, but it left a lingering sting. There was no hostility, no direct accusation, but the absence of warmth, the lack of the usual small pleasantries, spoke volumes. It was as though he had become invisible to her, or worse, a subject of pity, someone to be avoided. As Kofi walked away, the bag of rice heavy in his hands, he felt a deep sense of isolation. The village that had once been his home now felt foreign, as if he were a stranger walking through its familiar streets. The whispers were no longer just rumors. They had become a part of the fabric of his life, woven into every interaction, every glance. And though no one had openly condemned him, the judgment was there, lingering just beneath the surface. At home, things weren't much easier. His mother, though she loved him dearly, had grown increasingly distant since the gossip had reached her ears. She didn't say much, but her silence was heavy, laden with disapproval. Kofi could feel her disappointment in the way she avoided talking about Amina, in the way she would glance at him during meals, as if searching for the son she once knew, but now no longer understood. One evening, as they sat in silence at the dinner table, his mother finally spoke.
Kofi,
She began, her voice soft but firm.
you know what people are saying.
Kofi didn't look up. He focused on the bowl of food in front of him, stirring the rice with his spoon but not eating.
They're saying things that
She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words.
are hard to ignore.
He said nothing, letting her words hang in the air between them. There was nothing new in what she was saying. He had heard it all before, felt it in the looks and the whispers, but hearing it from his mother made it real in a way that nothing else had.
They don't understand.
She continued, her voice growing more strained.
You're young, Kofi. You have your whole life ahead of you. But Amina, she's lived hers.
Kofi's grip tightened around the spoon, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew she was trying to protect him, trying to guide him toward a path that would be easier, one that would lead him away from the judgment and the whispers. But the more she spoke, the more he felt the walls closing in around him.
I know you care for her,
His mother said after a long pause.
but people won't accept it.
Kofi finally looked up, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep sadness, a weariness that came from months of carrying the weight of everyone else's opinions. His mother saw it too, and for a moment her expression softened, but the moment passed quickly, and she lowered her gaze, her silence speaking louder than any words. In the days that followed, Kofi found himself withdrawing further from the village. He stopped lingering in the marketplace, stopped visiting the places where people gathered. The judgment had become too much, too heavy to bear. Even when people didn't say anything outright, their silence was enough. It was as if he had become a shadow, moving through the village unnoticed, unwelcome. Amina, too, felt the weight of the village's disapproval. Though she had long since stopped caring what others thought of her, the judgment was different now. It wasn't just about her. It was about Kofi. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the way it wore him down little by little. Each time he came to visit, she could sense the heaviness in his steps, the way his once bright spirit had dimmed. She had lived through many things in her life, loss, heartache, disappointment. But this was different. This was a love she had never expected to find, a connection she hadn't anticipated. And now it was being threatened by the very people who had once respected her. The irony was not lost on her, but Amina remained strong. She knew that love, real love, was worth fighting for even in the face of judgment. And so she continued her work, tending to her garden, making her remedies, and welcoming Kofi with the same quiet grace she always had. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the savannah, Kofi arrived at Amina's hut. He looked tired, more worn down than usual. He didn't say much as he sat by the fire, his eyes distant, his thoughts far away. Amina watched him for a long time, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she couldn't protect him from the world outside. She had always been strong, had always faced judgment with a quiet resilience. But seeing Kofi like this, she realized that the burden of facing judgment was harder when it wasn't just her own to bear. She didn't speak, didn't try to comfort him with words. Instead, she sat beside him, her presence steady and grounding, as it always had been. In the silence, they shared a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of the struggle they were facing together. The world outside may have judged them, may have whispered and gossiped, but in that moment, in the warmth of Amina's hut, they were safe. And that, for now, was enough. As the rains had come and gone, leaving the village of Ngala awash in a vibrant green, the savannah reborn after the long dry season. The air was cooler now, fresh with the scent of damp earth and growing things. Life in the village slowly returned to its rhythm, but for Kofi and Amina, the weight of the world had not lessened. The judgment of their relationship still lingered in every interaction, every look. Yet beneath that, something else had taken root, something deeper, stronger. A quiet resolve had grown between them, fed by the very adversity they faced. Kofi had changed over the months. The lightness that once defined his spirit had dimmed, not extinguished, but altered. The village's judgment had left its mark on him, a quiet scar that only Amina seemed to see, but he did not retreat. If anything, his connection to Amina had only deepened, as though the pressure from the outside world had forged something unbreakable between them. His visits to her hut continued, as frequent as ever, though now they were no longer just escapes from the world. They had become something more, a refuge, a sanctuary where the burdens of judgment melted away in the quiet peace of her company. He no longer hesitated at her door, no longer glanced over his shoulder to see if anyone was watching. Instead, he approached her home with a quiet determination, a sense of purpose that he had never fully realized before. Amina, for her part, remained the steady presence she had always been. Though the weight of the villagers' disapproval hung in the air, she never spoke of it. She didn't need to. Her actions, her quiet strength, were enough to remind Kofi that they were in this together, that no matter how heavy the judgment of the world outside, they had each other. And in that, they found their strength. And one afternoon, as Kofi arrived at Amina's hut, he was struck by the sense of stillness that surrounded her home. The air was thick with the quiet hum of insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant call of birds. It was a peaceful scene, one that seemed to exist outside of time, untouched by the chaos of the village beyond. As he approached the garden, he saw Amina kneeling by the herbs, her hands gently tending to the plants, her movements slow and deliberate. He stood for a moment, watching her. There was something about the way she worked, something that had always fascinated him. She moved with such care, such precision, as though every plant, every leaf, was a part of some larger, unseen pattern. Her connection to the earth was something he admired, something he longed to understand in the way she did. Amina didn't look up as Kofi approached, but she knew he was there. She always knew. Without pausing in her work, she gestured for him to join her. He moved quietly, sitting down beside her, the soft earth cool beneath him. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the gentle rustling of the plants and the faint breeze that whispered through the trees. Kofi watched her hands as she worked, the way they moved with a practiced ease, the way her fingers seemed to know exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to release. There was a grace in her movements that he had never quite seen in anyone else. It was as if her hands carried the wisdom of the earth itself. For a while, he simply watched, content to be near her, to share in the quiet rhythm of her work. It was in these moments of silence that he felt the depth of their connection most strongly. Words were unnecessary between them. Their bond had grown beyond the need for explanation or conversation. It existed in the spaces between actions, in the quiet understanding that came from simply being together. After a while, Amina paused in her work and sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on a cloth. She didn't speak, but her gaze found Kofi's, and in that look, there was a world of unspoken understanding. She knew what he was thinking, what he was feeling. She always did. Kofi didn't say anything in return. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached out and took her hand in his, their fingers entwining in a gesture that was as natural as breathing. There was no need for words in that moment. The simple act of holding her hand was enough to remind him that they were stronger together, that the world outside, with all its judgments and whispers, could not touch what they had built between them. For months, Kofi had struggled with the weight of the village's judgment. He had felt its pressure in every interaction, had seen it in the eyes of his neighbors, his friends, even his own family. But here, with Amina, all of that faded away. In her presence, he felt lighter, freer. The judgment of the world seemed distant, almost insignificant in comparison to the quiet strength they found in each other. The village could judge them all it wanted. It could whisper and gossip. It could turn its back on them. But it couldn't take away the bond they had forged. It couldn't touch the quiet moments they shared, the understanding that ran deeper than words. In a world that sought to tear them apart, they had found something unbreakable. As the weeks passed, Kofi and Amina's relationship became a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to divide them. They didn't speak of it openly, didn't confront the judgment head-on. Instead, they resisted in their own way, by simply being together, by continuing to care for one another despite the disapproval of those around them. In the quiet moments they shared, Kofi found a new kind of strength. It was not the loud, forceful strength that came from defiance or anger. It was a quieter, more resilient strength, one that came from knowing that no matter what the world threw at them, they would face it together. The village continued to whisper, to judge, but Kofi and Amina had grown beyond that. They had built a world of their own, one that existed in the quiet moments between them, in the shared looks and the simple acts of kindness that spoke more than words ever could. They had found a refuge in each other, a place where the noise of the world could not reach them. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm golden light over the savannah, Kofi and Amina sat together outside her hut. The air was cool, the scent of the earth rich and comforting. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. Kofi gazed out at the horizon, his hand still holding Amina's. He thought about the village, about the people who had once been his friends, about the life he had once known. It all seemed so far away now, as though it belonged to another person, another time. His world had changed, had narrowed to this small, quiet place beside Amina. And in that he had found a kind of the judgment of the village no longer mattered. It no longer held power over him. What mattered was the quiet strength he had found in Amina, the way their love had grown in the face of adversity. Together, they had weathered the storm, and now, as the sun set on another day, they were still standing. There would be more challenges ahead, Kofi knew. The world would not suddenly accept them, would not suddenly change its views. But that was all right. He had found something stronger than the world's judgment, something that could not be shaken by the opinions of others. He had found Amina, and in her, he had found a strength that would carry them both through whatever came next. As the light faded and the stars began to appear in the sky, Kofi looked over at Amina. She was gazing out at the horizon, her face calm, her eyes thoughtful. He squeezed her hand gently, and she looked over at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. In that moment, Kofi knew that they would be all right. They had each other, and that was enough. The world outside could judge, could whisper, could turn its back on them. But here, in the quiet space they had built together, they were untouchable, and that, more than anything, gave them the strength to keep going. The passage of time in Agala was marked by the changing seasons, by the rains that swept across the savannah, and the dry winds that followed in their wake. Life moved in cycles, and yet for Kofi and Amina, time felt different, stretched, elongated, as if their love existed outside the rhythm of the village, beyond the ebb and flow of ordinary life. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, their bond remained, quietly enduring the trials that the world had placed before them. The village had not forgotten them. The judgment had not disappeared. The whispers continued, though they had grown softer with time. The sharpness of gossip dulled by the constancy of Kofi and Amina's presence in each other's lives. The villagers still watched them with curious eyes, still wondered at the connection between the young artist and the much older healer, but the outrage that had once flared had settled into a kind of resigned acceptance. They could not change what was between Kofi and Amina, and in time, they simply stopped trying. But even as the village quieted, the bond between Kofi and Amina only deepened. It was not a love built on fiery passion or the excitement of new beginnings. Rather, it was a love that grew slowly, steadily, like the roots of a great tree, sinking deeper into the earth with each passing day. It was a love that existed in the small moments, in the shared silences, in the simple act of being together. In the mornings, Kofi would often wake early and walk to Amina's hut before the sun had fully risen. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by his many visits, and the village, still asleep, felt like a distant memory. The cool air of dawn brushed against his skin, and the soft sound of his footsteps was the only noise that disturbed the quiet. As he approached Amina's home, he would sometimes pause, taking in the sight of the small house nestled among the trees, its garden blooming with life, even in the dry season. It was a place of refuge, of peace, a world apart from the one he had once known. Amina would often be awake when he arrived, tending to her herbs or preparing tea. She would greet him with a nod, her eyes warm but without the need for words. They had long since moved beyond the need for conversation. Their relationship was built on something deeper, something unspoken, and in the quiet moments they shared, they found a kind of intimacy that few others could understand. The days they spent together were not filled with grand gestures or declarations of love. Instead, they were filled with the quiet rhythms of life, the tending of the garden, the preparation of meals, the shared moments of stillness as they watched the world around them change. Kofi would sit by the fire in Amina's small home, sketching in his book or simply watching her as she worked. There was a peace in those moments, a sense of completeness that neither of them had expected to find. Their love was a quiet thing, but it was not fragile. It had been forged in the fires of judgment, tested by the harsh opinions of others, and it had emerged stronger for it. Each day that passed was a testament to their resilience, to their commitment to one another. They did not need the approval of the village, nor did they seek it. They had found something that transcended the narrow views of those around them, something that could not be broken by whispers or stares. As the years passed, the world around them changed. The village grew, new families arrived, children were born, and the landscape of Nagala shifted. But through it all, Kofi and Amina remained a constant presence, their love enduring even as the world moved. The judgment that had once followed them like a shadow began to fade, the villagers growing accustomed to their quiet existence. What had once been a source of gossip had become a part of the village's story, a thread woven into the fabric of life in Nagala. The people began to speak of them with a kind of reluctant respect. They were no longer the scandalous couple that defied convention, but rather a symbol of something more profound, a love that had survived, that had weathered the storms of judgment and emerged strong. Those who had once whispered about them now spoke of their bond in hushed tones, as though it was something sacred, something beyond the understanding of ordinary people. Kofi, now in his 30s, had grown into his own. The boy who had once struggled with the weight of the village's disapproval had become a man confident in his choices, secure in the life he had built with Amina. His art, once a refugee from the world, had flourished, reflecting the depth of his experiences and the richness of his relationship with Amina. His sketches, once simple studies of the landscape and the people around him, had evolved into something more: portraits of life, of love. Each stroke of his pencil, each line on the page, was a testament to the life he had chosen, the love he had found. Amina, too, had changed. The years had softened her in some ways, but in others she remained as strong as ever. Her hands, though older now, still moved with the same grace and precision, her knowledge of herbs and healing as sharp as it had ever been. She was respected in the village, not just for her wisdom, but for the quiet dignity with which she had lived her life. People came to her not only for remedies, but for advice, for comfort, for the kind of understanding that only comes from a life well lived. But though the world around them had changed, though the village had grown and shifted, Kofi and Amina's love remained constant. It was a love that had been shaped by time, by the slow accumulation of shared moments, by the quiet strength they found in each other. It was not the kind of love that burned brightly and then faded. It was the kind of love that endured, that deepened with each passing year, that grew stronger in the face of adversity. There were no grand declarations between them, no need for words to express what they felt. Their love was written in the way Kofi's hand would brush against Amina's as they worked side by side in the garden, in the way Amina would gently place a cup of tea in front of him without a word, in the way they would sit together in the evening, watching the sun set over the savannah, the sky painted in shades of gold and purple. In the quiet of those moments, they found their strength. In the stillness of the world around them, they knew that their love was something that could not be touched by time or by the judgment of others. It was a love that had endured, that would continue to endure, long after the whispers had faded, long after the village had moved on. And as the years continued to pass, Kofi and Amina's love became a part of the landscape of Ngala, as constant as the trees that lined the horizon, as enduring as the winds that swept across the savannah. It was a love that had been tested and had emerged stronger for it, a love that would stand the test of time, a quiet, unbreakable bond between two souls who had found strength in each other. In the end, it was not the judgment of the world that defined them, but the love they had shared, the life they had built together. And as they grew older, as the seasons continued to change, they knew that what they had found in each other was something rare, something precious. It was a love that would endure, quietly, steadily, through all the years to come. Kofi's visits to Amina's hut began with a simple need for healing. The remedy she had given him for his physical pain had worked swiftly, as promised, and by the next morning, he felt the ache that had plagued him for days begin to subside. Yet, despite his physical relief, something inside Kofi felt unsettled. It wasn't a sharp or specific discomfort, but rather a quiet, persistent restlessness that seemed to stir in the back of his mind. He couldn't place its origin, but the feeling lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. At first, Kofi thought nothing of his frequent trips to Amina's small home on the outskirts of the village. He convinced himself that he needed more herbs, that he wanted to ask her about the plants she used in her remedies, or that he was simply curious about her methods. But as the days turned into weeks, Kofi began to realize that his visits weren't about herbs or medicine. He was drawn to something far less tangible, something he couldn't quite name. Amina's presence had become a strange sort of balm for the unease that gripped him, and the more time he spent around her, the more he craved the quiet strength that radiated from her. There was a calmness about Amina, a stillness that stood in stark contrast to the noise and busyness of the village. In her presence, Kofi found a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. As the world slowed down around her, the rush of daily life fading into the background as she moved through her routines with a deliberate grace. He found comfort in the way she worked, her hands deftly grinding herbs, mixing potions, and tending to her garden. Everything she did was purposeful, yet unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. Kofi, who'd always felt somewhat out of place in the village, began to find a kind of belonging in the quiet of Amina's company. His art had always been his escape, a way to express the emotions he couldn't articulate in words, but even that lately had felt out of reach. The vibrant colors and bold strokes that had once flowed effortlessly from his hand now seemed dull and lifeless. He had tried to push through the creative block, to force himself to find inspiration in the familiar landscapes of the savannah, but nothing had worked. His world, which had once been filled with light and creativity, felt smaller and dimmer with each passing day. Yet in Amina's presence, something began to shift. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't dramatic. Rather, it was subtle, like the slow lifting of a fog. He would sit in the shade of the acacia tree outside her hut, watching her tend to her garden or prepare remedies, and he would feel the edges of his thoughts soften. The weight that had pressed on his chest for so long seemed to ease, if only for a little while. Kofi hadn't planned to spend so much time with Amina. At first, he would only stay for a few minutes after receiving whatever herbs or remedies she had prepared for him. But gradually, those minutes stretched into hours. He found reasons to linger, to ask her about a plant, to watch her work, to sketch in his notebook while she ground leaves in her mortar. He didn't speak much during these visits, and neither did Amina. There was no need for conversation between them. The silence that filled the space between them was not uncomfortable, but rather, it was comforting, like the quiet after a long day of noise. As the weeks passed, Kofi realized that he had come to depend on these moments of stillness more than he cared to admit. The rest of his life felt chaotic and uncertain, but in Amina's small, modest hut, there was a sense of order, of stability. He knew that when he walked up the path to her home, she would be there, seated under the acacia tree or working in her garden. She never seemed surprised to see him, and she never questioned his presence. She accepted him into her space with the same calm grace she brought to everything else in her life. Kofi began to notice things about Amina that he hadn't paid attention to before. The way her hands, though calloused and weathered from years of labor, moved with a delicate precision when handling plants. The way her dark eyes, filled with quiet wisdom, would occasionally flicker toward him, as if she could sense the restlessness inside him. He admired her strength, her independence, and her deep connection to the land. She had lived alone for many years, carving out a life for herself on the outskirts of the village, and she seemed content in her solitude. Yet, she was not closed off or distant. She was welcoming, but in a way that didn't intrude. She allowed people into her life on her own terms, and Kofi found that deeply admirable. His dependence on Amina grew, though he tried not to acknowledge it, even to himself. At night, when he lay awake in his small home, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts would drift to her. He would think about the quiet moments they shared, the peace he felt in her presence, and the way the tension in his chest seemed to dissolve when he was with her. He told himself that it was nothing more than a friendship, a simple connection born of mutual respect. But as time went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. Kofi had always been a private person, even with his closest friends and family. He wasn't one to talk about his emotions or share his inner thoughts. His art had been his way of communicating with the world, but now even that outlet felt distant. Amina, however, seemed to understand him without the need for words. She never pried or asked personal questions, but in her presence, Kofi felt seen in a way he hadn't in a long time. His visits to her hut became a regular part of his routine, though he struggled to explain why. It wasn't just the peace and quiet that drew him back. It was something deeper, something unspoken. He had come to rely on her not for physical healing, but for something more intangible. She was a grounding force in his life, and without realizing it, Kofi had begun to shape his days around the time he spent with her. But with that growing dependence came a quiet fear. He worried about what the village would think if they knew how often he visited Amina. He worried about the whispers that had already started to circulate. Whispers about why a young man like him would spend so much time with an older woman like her. He knew the villagers were watching, their curious eyes lingering on him a little too long when he passed them in the streets. He'd never cared much for gossip, but the weight of their judgment began to press on him, especially when he was alone. Yet, despite that fear, he couldn't stay away. There was something about Amina that he needed, something he couldn't find anywhere else. His visits to her became a kind of refuge, a space where he could breathe freely, without the expectations and pressures of the outside world. He didn't have to be the promising young artist or the dutiful son when he was with her. He could just be Kofi, a man searching for something he hadn't even known he was missing. In Amina's presence, he felt both grounded and adrift, as if he were being drawn into something larger than himself. He didn't fully understand the connection they shared, but he knew it was important. He knew it was something rare. And so, despite the growing whispers, despite the unease that settled in his chest whenever he left her hut, Kofi continued to visit. Each time, he found himself staying a little longer, lingering in the quiet, soaking in the peace that only Amina seemed able to provide. His dependence on her, once small and unnoticed, had grown into something undeniable. Kofi wasn't sure where this path would lead him. All he knew was that Amina had become a vital part of his life, and he wasn't ready to let that go. Not yet, not ever, if he could help it. The village of N was a quiet place, nestled near the vast African savanna, where life moved in slow, predictable rhythms. The people of the village were deeply connected to the land, their lives shaped by the changing seasons, the cycle of the rains and the harvest. It was a small community where everyone knew everyone else, and privacy was more a suggestion than a reality. In N, every action, every glance, and every word was observed, interpreted, and shared, usually accompanied by whisper. At first, Kofi's visits to Amina went unnoticed, seen as an ordinary interaction between a young man seeking the help of an elder healer. Amina had been a fixture in the village for as long as anyone could remember. She was respected for her wisdom, her knowledge of herbs, and the quiet strength she carried, having lived through the trials of life with dignity. It wasn't unusual for people to seek her out for remedies when the local clinic's supplies were insufficient or the doctor couldn't provide answers. To most, Amina's hut, perched on the outskirts of the village, was a place of healing, not of scandal. But in a village as small and close-knit as N, even the most innocent things could take on a life of their own. It began slowly, with little more than curious looks and raised eyebrows when Kofi, a young man of 25, was seen walking the path to Amina's home more often than seemed necessary. At first, the villagers shrugged it off. Perhaps he was unwell, some thought. Or maybe he was seeking her advice on something more personal, like many others before him. But as his visits became more frequent, the whispers began to stir. Kofi had always been somewhat of an outsider in the village. As an artist, he had never quite fit into the traditional roles expected of young men. While others his age were focused on family, work, and the practicalities of village life, Kofi spent his days painting and sketching, lost in his own world of colors and shapes. His art was admired, but it also set him apart. People didn't quite know what to make of him, and that made him a subject of quiet curiosity. Amina, too, had always walked her own path. She lived alone, never having remarried after the death of her husband many years ago. The villagers respected her for her healing abilities, but there was a sense of mystery that surrounded her as well. She kept to herself, rarely venturing into the village unless necessary, and though people came to her for help, they didn't know much about her life beyond her role as a healer. The combination of her solitude and her deep knowledge of plants and medicine gave her an almost mythical status in the eyes of some, and with that came a certain degree of wariness. As Kofi's visits to Amina continued, the village began to talk. At first, the whispers were quiet, barely noticeable, snippets of conversation at the marketplace, exchanged between women selling fruit or men gathered at the well. "Have you seen Kofi lately? He's been going to Amina's quite a bit. I wonder what he's doing there so often. Maybe he's sick, or maybe it's something else." But as the weeks went by and Kofi's visits did not wane, the tone of the gossip shifted. It became less curious and more speculative. In small villages like N, where life was slow and uneventful, anything out of the ordinary quickly became fodder for conversation, and the idea of a young man like Kofi spending so much time with an older woman like Amina was certainly out of the ordinary. Soon, the gossip took on a more malicious edge. The whispers turned into stories, each retelling adding a new layer of intrigue and scandal. "They say he's spending hours there, just sitting with her. What could they possibly be doing all that time? He's not sick. I heard he's been better for weeks. So why is he still going? It's not proper, a young man like that, spending so much time alone with her. People are starting to talk. Maybe there's something going on between them." The village had a way of filling in the gaps where facts were lacking. What had started as innocent visits for healing had now become the subject of wild speculation. The older women, in particular, were relentless in their analysis, exchanging knowing glances and shaking their heads as they discussed what they thought they knew. They had raised children, they understood human nature, or so they believed, and they were quick to pass judgment. Kofi, wrapped up in his growing connection with Amina, was slow to notice the change. When he walked through the village, his mind was often elsewhere, thinking about his art, or about the last conversation he had with Amina. But eventually, even he couldn't ignore the way people's eyes lingered on him a little too long, the way conversations seemed to stop when he entered a room. He began to feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, though no one said anything to his face. The first real sign of trouble came one afternoon as Kofi made his way to the marketplace to buy some supplies. He was walking past a group of young men, boys he had known for most of his life, when one of them called out to him, his tone mocking. "Hey Kofi, going to see your old woman again?" The others snickered, their laughter echoing in the still air. Kofi stopped in his tracks, feeling a flush of anger rise in his chest. He didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction, but as he walked away, their laughter followed him, a bitter echo that clung to him long after he was out of earshot. That moment marked a shift in how Kofi saw his place in the village. He had always been aware that he was different, but now that difference was being used against him. The gossip had taken on a life of its own, and there was little he could do to stop it. The village had already decided what was happening between him and Amina, regardless of the truth. The pressure mounted over the next few weeks. Kofi began to dread his trips into the village, knowing that eyes would be on him, that people would be whispering behind his back. The once familiar streets now felt hostile, the marketplace no longer a place of community, but a gauntlet he had to run every time he needed something. The vendors, who'd always greeted him with smiles and small talk, now avoided his gaze, their conversations clipped and formal. Even at home, the tension was palpable. Kofi lived with his mother, a strong-willed woman who had raised him on her own after his father's death. She had always been proud of him, even if she didn't fully understand his artistic ambitions. But now she too had heard the whispers, and though she hadn't said anything at first, Kofi could feel her disapproval in the air between them. One evening, as they sat together at the small table in their home, his mother finally broke the silence. "Kofi," she began, her voice soft but firm. "People are talking." Kofi didn't look up. He knew what she meant, and he didn't want to have this conversation. He focused on his food, stirring the stew on his plate without eating it. "They're saying things that aren't true," she continued, her tone heavy with concern. "You've been spending a lot of time with Amina." There it was. The thing that had been hanging between them for weeks, finally spoken out loud. Kofi felt a knot tighten in his chest. He didn't know how to explain it to her, how to make her understand. To him, his visits to Amina were about more than just companionship. They were about peace, about finding something that had been missing in his life. But how could he explain that to his mother, who only saw the surface of things? "She's my friend," Kofi said quietly, though even as the words left his mouth, they felt inadequate. His mother looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She said carefully, "Amina is much older than you. She's lived her life. You're just starting yours. People are judging and it's not fair to either of you." He knew she was right. The village didn't understand. They didn't see Amina the way he did, didn't know the depth of the connection they shared. But the weight of their judgment was real, and it was growing heavier with each passing day. Over time, the whispers in the village became louder, more pointed. People who'd once been friendly began to distance themselves. His friends grew cold, their conversations strained and uncomfortable. Those women at the market gave him sidelong glances, their smiles laced with pity or disapproval. Kofi could feel the walls closing in around him, the village turning its back on him. But through it all, Kofi continued to visit Amina. Her hut, nestled at the edge of the village, had become his refuge, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. In her presence, the judgment and gossip seemed to fade away, replaced by the quiet peace that he had come to depend on. Amina never spoke of the rumors, never asked him about the village's reaction to their friendship. She accepted him without question, as she always had, and in that acceptance, Kofi found strength. Yet, the pressure of the village's judgment was not something he could completely escape. It weighed on him, pressing down on him with every step he took outside Amina's hut. The once comfortable world of the village had become a hostile place, and though Kofi tried to ignore it, he knew that something had shifted. He was no longer just the artist who lived on the outskirts of tradition. He was now an object of scandal, a subject of gossip, and it was a role he hadn't asked for. As the days turned into weeks, Kofi began to wonder how much longer he could endure the weight of the village's judgment. The burden of secrecy settled over Kofi like a heavy, invisible weight, creeping into every corner of his life. It had started so gradually that he hadn't noticed it at first. Just a few glances, a couple of hushed conversations that fell silent as he approached. But as time passed, that weight grew, and soon it was all-consuming. The secrecy wasn't something he had chosen, not at first, but it wrapped itself around him, pulling him deeper into its grip, until every moment of his life felt shadowed by it. In the beginning, Kofi didn't think much about what others might say. His visits to Amina had felt natural, almost necessary. She had become a part of his routine, a source of calm in a world that often felt chaotic and overwhelming. But the longer he spent in her presence, the more he realized that the village did not see things the way he did. What had started as innocent conversations with an elder soon took on a life of its own in the minds of the villagers. The whispers that followed him around town were a constant reminder that the world outside Amina's hut was not as accepting as the quiet sanctuary within it. As the rumors about him and Amina spread, Kofi felt the walls of the village closing in. It wasn't that anyone confronted him directly, at least, not yet. But the silence, the looks, the way people avoided his gaze, said more than words ever could. And as the judgment grew, so did the burden of keeping the truth to himself. In the quiet moments, when Kofi was alone, he could admit to himself what was happening. His connection with Amina had gone beyond what he had initially understood. It wasn't just friendship, wasn't just comfort. There was something deeper between them, something that neither of them had spoken aloud, but both had felt. And that feeling, that pull toward Amina, was what made the secrecy so difficult to bear. Kofi wasn't ashamed of his feelings for Amina. He knew that what they shared, even if unspoken, was real, was meaningful. But he also knew that the village would never accept it. In their eyes, there were too many things that separated him and Amina. Her age, her position in the village, her solitude. They would never understand how much peace he found in her company, how her wisdom and calm presence filled a void in his life that no one else could. They would never accept the possibility that someone like him, young and full of potential, could be drawn to someone like her, older and rooted in the past. And so, the secrecy became necessary, not because he wanted to hide, but because revealing the truth would bring a flood of consequences that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He began to live a double life, balancing the time he spent in Amina's quiet hut with the time he spent in the village, where every action was scrutinized, every glance a reminder of the judgment that awaited him. It was exhausting, always keeping part of himself hidden, always careful about what he said and did. His visits to Amina became even more precious to him in those months, not just because of the time they spent together, but because her home had become the only place where he didn't have to pretend. He could sit in silence, let the weight of the world fall away, and be himself. There was no need for words between them, no need to explain the tension that had grown inside him. Amina, with her quiet wisdom and her steady gaze, seemed to understand without him needing to speak. She never pressed him for answers, never asked about the rumors or the whispers in the village. Her silence was a gift, allowing Kofi to simply exist without the burden of explanation. But even as Kofi found solace in Amina's presence, the burden of secrecy continued to grow. It followed him like a shadow, creeping into every aspect of his life. He began to notice how guarded he had become, even around his own family. His mother, who had always been able to read him so easily, sensed that something was wrong. But Kofi avoided her questions. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, not because he didn't trust her, but because he feared the disappointment he would see in her eyes. At home, the silence between them grew heavier. His mother's questions were never direct, but he could feel them hanging in the air, unspoken but ever present. She would glance at him during dinner, her eyes filled with a quiet worry that he couldn't bring himself to address. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the village had, and though she hadn't confronted him outright, he knew that she was waiting for him to explain. But Kofi didn't know how to explain what even he was still trying to understand. How could he tell her about the depth of his connection with Amina when he wasn't sure where it was leading, or if it was something that could even be defined? The secrecy began to strain his relationships in other ways as well. His friends, once close and reliable, now kept their distance. Conversations that had once flowed easily now felt stilted, or they would talk about the usual things: work, the village, their families. But there was always an undercurrent of tension. Kofi knew that they too had heard the whispers, and though they never said it aloud, he could feel their judgment. They didn't understand why he continued to visit Amina, why he seemed so distant from the life they all shared. And so gradually, they stopped asking him to join them, stopped including him in their plans. Kofi found himself spending more and more time alone, retreating into his art, which had become both a refuge and a frustration. The more isolated he felt, the harder it came to create. His paintings, once vibrant and full of life, now felt flat, as if the colors had dulled along with his spirit. He would sit for hours with his sketchbook, staring at the blank pages, unable to find the inspiration that had once come so easily. Even his art had become burdened by the secrecy, by the weight of the things he couldn't say out loud. As the village continued to watch him, Kofi grew more careful about how he spent his time. He began timing his visits to Amina, making sure to arrive at her hut when the streets were quiet, when there were fewer eyes to see him walking the familiar path. He became attuned to the rhythms of the village, learning when the market was busiest, when the men gathered at the well, and when the women were most likely to be in the fields. It wasn't that he was ashamed of visiting Amina, but the whispers had become too loud to ignore. He couldn't afford to be seen too often, to give the villagers more fuel for their gossip, but the secrecy took its toll. The more he hid, the more isolated he felt, and the more isolated he felt, the more he longed for the peace he found with Amina. It was a vicious cycle, one that left him exhausted and anxious. He found himself torn between two worlds: the village, where he was expected to live according to tradition, and Amina's hut, where he could breathe freely, away from the constraints of judgment. In the village, Kofi became an expert at deflecting questions. When people asked about his days, he gave vague answers, careful not to reveal too much. He smiled when he was expected to, laughed at jokes he didn't find funny, and pretended that everything was normal. But beneath the surface, he was always on edge, waiting for the moment when someone would confront him directly, when the burden of secrecy would become too heavy to bear. Even with Amina, there was a sense of the unspoken between them. They never discussed the whispers, never acknowledged the tension that had grown around their relationship. It was as if they had made an unspoken agreement to keep the outside world at bay, to preserve the peace they found in each other's company. But Kofi knew that the secrecy couldn't last forever. There would come a time when they would have to face the reality of what was happening, when the villagers' judgment would force them to make choices they weren't ready to make. The secrecy was a double-edged sword. It protected Kofi from the immediate consequences of the villagers' disapproval, but it also isolated him from the people who had once been his community. He began to wonder how long he could continue living this way, divided between two worlds, with one foot in the village and the other in the quiet sanctuary of Amina's hut. The burden of secrecy weighed heavier with each passing day, and Kofi knew that eventually something would have to give. The more he tried to keep the truth hidden, the more it threatened to unravel. The secrecy had become a prison of his own making, and though Amina's presence brought him peace, the cost of maintaining that peace was becoming too high. He couldn't keep living in the shadows, pretending that the whispers didn't affect him, pretending that the secrecy didn't tear at him a little more each day. In his heart, Kofi knew that the burden of secrecy was unsustainable, but letting go of it would mean confronting the village, confronting his own feelings, and confronting the reality of his relationship with Amina. And that, more than anything, was what terrified him the most. Amina moved through life with a steady, unshakable calm that had become her signature over the years. Her presence in the village was a quiet one, but it was deeply felt. While others in N might have sought attention or validation in their actions, Amina had always lived outside the circle of noise and gossip that governed the small, close-knit community. Her strength lay in her silence, in the deep, unspoken wisdom that seemed to radiate from her very being. It was this strength, quiet, resilient, and constant, that had drawn Kofi to her. She had never been one to seek out the approval of others, nor had she ever let the opinions of the village shape her sense of self. Amina had lived through too much, seen too many seasons of life pass by, to be swayed by the transient judgments of others. In her 60 years she had known love and loss, joy and sorrow. These experiences had carved deep lines into her face, but they had also left her with a profound sense of understanding. She knew that life, like the seasons, moved in cycles, each moment fleeting, each judgment temporary. Her solitude had always been a choice, not a burden. After her husband's death, Amina had built a life for herself on the outskirts of the village, where she could tend to her garden and her healing remedies in peace. The village respected her for her knowledge of herbs and her ability to heal both the body and the spirit. But there had always been an undercurrent of distance. Amina was different, an enigma. She carried herself with a dignity that made others hesitate to approach her with anything but reverence. Even the village elders, who often gossiped and criticized, had always been careful in their words about Amina. She was a figure of quiet authority, and there was something about her that made people think twice before speaking ill of her. But it was more than just her reputation as a healer that made Amina strong. Her strength came from within, from a place that had been forged in the fires of hardship. She had known suffering, not just from the loss of her husband, but from the countless small heartbreaks that life inevitably brings. Each one had tested her, but none had broken her. Instead, they had shaped her into someone who could stand firm in the face of adversity, someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. This quiet strength was something Kofi had sensed from the moment he first came to her for help. It wasn't that Amina offered him grand gestures of wisdom or advice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. She had a way of being fully present in the moment, her attention unwavering, and that made those around her feel seen and understood without her needing to say much. When Kofi sat with her in the afternoons, watching her work with the plants, there was a stillness to her movements that made the world feel slower, calmer. It was as if time bent around her, allowing space for everything to breathe, to settle. Her hands, weathered from years of tending to the earth and preparing remedies, moved with a kind of grace that only comes from years of experience. Each movement was deliberate, thoughtful, but unhurried. Whether she was grinding herbs or tying together bundles of plants, there was a rhythm to her work that echoed the rhythms of nature itself. Kofi would often find himself mesmerized by the way her hands moved, the way she seemed to be in perfect harmony with the world around her. Amina's strength was in her ability to remain grounded, even when the world outside her small hut was turbulent. The village might whisper and judge, but those whispers never seemed to reach her. She was aware of the gossip, of course. She wasn't naive. She knew what people were saying about Kofi's visits, about their connection. But Amina didn't let it affect her. She had long ago learned that people's opinions were fleeting, and that what mattered most was her own sense of peace. As long as she remained true to herself, the rest was noise. In moments of tension, when Kofi would arrive at her hut clearly weighed down by the burden of secrecy and judgment, Amina would simply sit with him, offering the steady calm that he so desperately needed. She didn't try to fix his problems or offer him solutions. She knew that wasn't what he needed. Instead, she gave him space to breathe, to feel, to let go of the heaviness that followed him everywhere else. Her silence wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with a kind of compassion that required no words. Even in her solitude, Amina was never lonely. She had found contentment in her quiet life, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the small joys of her daily routines. Her garden was a testament to this, each plant carefully tended, each herb growing in harmony with the others. The garden was not just a source of food and medicine, it was a reflection of Amina herself. It was a place of quiet beauty, a space where things grew not through force or urgency, but through patience and care. Kofi had come to depend on that strength, though he hadn't realized it at first. It was only in Amina's presence that he felt truly at peace, that the noise of the world fell away. She had become his anchor, the one constant in a life that felt increasingly chaotic and uncertain. And yet, even as Kofi relied more and more on her, Amina never imposed herself on him. She allowed him to come and go as he pleased, to take what he needed from their time together without asking for anything in return. There was power in her restraint, in her ability to let things unfold in their own time. She never pushed Kofi to talk about the village or the whispers that followed him. She knew that, in time, he would find his way through the fog of judgment that clouded his mind, and when he was ready, she would be there, as she always was, steady, grounded and unshaken by the world outside. Amina's strength was not the kind that demanded attention or recognition. It was the kind that moved quietly beneath the surface, like the roots of the trees that surrounded her home, deeply embedded in the earth, unmovable by the winds that swept across the savannah. She had no need to prove herself to anyone. Her life was her testament, and in that quiet strength, Kofi had found not just solace, but a guide, a reminder that true strength wasn't about fighting against the world, but about finding peace within oneself, no matter what storms might come. In Amina, Kofi had found a kind of strength he hadn't known existed, one that didn't shout or demand, but simply endured. It was this strength, more than anything else, that gave him the courage to face the village, to face the whispers, and to face the growing feelings he carried in his heart. Amina had shown him that there was power in stillness, in patience, and in the quiet acceptance of life's uncertainties. It was a lesson he would carry with him, long after the storms of judgment had passed. Love for Kofi had never been something he had actively sought out. It had always seemed like a distant concept, wrapped up in the lives of others, bound by expectations and societal norms that didn't quite fit him. His world had been art, quiet observation, and the solace he found in the landscape of the savannah and the colors he captured on his canvas. But with Amina, love had come unexpectedly, quietly threading its way into his life, not with the fiery passion of youthful infatuation, but with the slow, steady warmth of understanding. In Amina's presence, Kofi found a peace he hadn't known he needed. There was no pretense with her, no expectations or pressures to be anyone other than who he was. She accepted him fully, without question or judgment, in a way that no one else ever had. And in return, Kofi felt something deep and powerful grow within him, something that had started as admiration and respect, but had slowly blossomed into love. This love wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, enduring, and rooted in the shared moments of silence, in the steady rhythms of their lives together. That love, especially a love that defied the norms of the village, came with a cost. The more time Kofi spent with Amina, the more he felt the weight of the village's disapproval pressing down on him. The whispers, once barely noticeable, had grown louder, sharper. Everywhere he went, he felt the eyes of the villagers on him, their judgment hanging in the air like a heavy mist. They couldn't understand why a young man like him would spend so much time with a woman so much older, a woman who lived on the outskirts of their community, both literally and figuratively. In the villagers' eyes, Kofi's relationship with Amina was unnatural, something to be questioned, something to be stopped. The traditional roles expected of him, to find a young woman to settle down, to start a family, were being upended, and the village didn't know how to handle that. Their gossip became a form of control, a way of trying to pull him back into the fold, back into the expectations that had governed their lives for generations. But Kofi was not one to be easily swayed. His love for Amina, though unspoken, was strong enough to withstand the pressure of their judgment. He didn't need the approval of the village to validate what he felt. In fact, the more the villagers gossiped, the more he felt a quiet defiance build within him. Their disapproval, rather than pushing him away from Amina, only strengthened his resolve to remain by her side. He knew deep down that what they shared was real, was meaningful, and no amount of whispers or disapproving looks could change that. Kofi's defiance wasn't loud or confrontational. It didn't take the form of public declarations or grand gestures. Instead, it was woven into the small, everyday choices he made. It was in the way he continued to walk the well-worn path to Amina's hut, despite knowing that every step he took would be noted by the villagers. It was in the way he sat with her under the shade of the acacia tree, working in companionable silence, as if the outside world didn't exist. It was in the way he allowed himself to feel the quiet joy of their connection, even as he knew that others wouldn't understand it. Defiance for Kofi meant refusing to let the world dictate the terms of his happiness. It meant choosing love, even when that love didn't fit neatly into the boxes that others had created for him. And in that choice, he found a freedom he hadn't known before, a freedom to live on his own terms, to create a life that was true to who he was, rather than who the village expected him to be. Amina, too, understood this defiance, though she never spoke of it directly. She had lived long enough to know that love, in whatever form it took, was worth protecting. Her strength, quiet and steady as always, gave Kofi the courage to stand firm in the face of the village's judgment. She didn't ask him to choose between her and the village, didn't pressure him to take a stand. Instead, she simply continued to offer him the space to be himself, to come to her when he needed, to find peace in their shared moments. Their love became a quiet rebellion against the world outside, a rebellion not of words or confrontations, but of presence. By continuing to be together, by refusing to let the village's disapproval break them apart, they were making a statement. Their love was an act of defiance in itself, a refusal to bend to the expectations that others had placed on them. In the evenings, as the sun dipped low over the savannah and the sky turned shades of gold and crimson, Kofi would sit with Amina, their hands sometimes brushing as they worked in the garden or shared a meal. The air around them was thick with unspoken understanding. They didn't need to discuss the whispers or the disapproval that hovered just beyond the edge of their world. They both knew it was there, but they also knew that it didn't matter. What mattered was the connection they shared, the way they understood each other without needing to speak. Their love had become a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the village couldn't reach them. In Amina's presence, Kofi felt whole, felt seen in a way that he hadn't been before. And in turn, Amina found in Kofi a companionship that had long been absent from her life. Their bond, though unconventional, was something sacred to both of them. The defiance they shared wasn't just about resisting the village's judgment. It was about living authentically, about refusing to let the world tell them who they were allowed to love. As the seasons passed, the village's whispers continued, but Kofi and Amina remained unchanged. Their love, forged in the quiet defiance of others' expectations, it grew stronger with each passing day, nourished by the stillness they found in each other and the refusal to let the world define them. In the end, their defiance wasn't about fighting back. It was about standing firm, about choosing love, even when the world told them they shouldn't. And in that choice, they found a strength that was unshakable, a love that was truly their own. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the savannah, as Kofi sat in silence outside Amina's small hut. The air was cooler now, carrying with it the scent of damp earth from the recent rains. It had been a tumultuous season for both of them, one filled with tension and unspoken fears. But as they sat together in the stillness of the evening, there was a sense of something new lingering in the air. It was fragile, like the first green shoots after a storm, but it was there, a new beginning. Kofi had never been one to dwell too much on the future. He had always lived in the moment, guided by his art, by his instincts, and by the quiet rhythms of life in the village. But the last few months had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The weight of the village's judgment, the constant whispers and sideways glances, had pressed down on him, forcing him to confront parts of himself that he had long kept hidden. His relationship with Amina, once a quiet refuge, had become something much more complex, something that defied the expectations of everyone around them, including themselves. For a long time, Kofi had been afraid of what the village would say, afraid of losing the respect of his family, and afraid of acknowledging the depth of his feelings for Amina. But now, as they sat in the fading light, those fears seemed distant, almost unreal. What had once seemed like insurmountable obstacles now felt like memories of a life that no longer belonged to him. He had made his choice. He had chosen love, chosen Amina, and with that choice came a kind of freedom he had never known before. But with that freedom came uncertainty. Kofi knew that this new beginning, this fragile sense of peace between them, was not without its challenges. The village had not forgotten them. The judgment had not disappeared. It still lingered in the background, a constant hum of disapproval that followed them wherever they went. The whispers had softened, yes, but they had not gone away. People still watched, still waited, still questioned what they did not understand. And yet, as fragile as this new beginning was, Kofi felt a deep sense of resolve growing within him. The bond he shared with Amina had been tested by the harshest of circumstances, by the weight of tradition, by the expectations of a community that could not accept their love, and by the internal conflict that had raged inside him for months. But they had endured. Their love, though unconventional, had survived. And now, standing on the edge of this new chapter in their lives, Kofi was determined to protect it. Amina, as always, sat quietly beside him, her presence grounding him in a way that nothing else could. She had weathered the storm with the same calm resilience that had defined her life for so many years. The village's judgment had never shaken her. She had seen too much, lived through too many trials, to be moved by the opinions of others. Her focus had always been on the things that truly mattered: the earth, the cycles of life, the quiet beauty of her garden. And now Kofi had become part of that world, a world where the noise of the outside couldn't touch them. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. They continued to meet at Amina's hut, as they always had, finding comfort in the simplicity of their routine. Kofi still brought his sketchbook, though these days he found himself sketching less and less. Instead, he spent more time simply being, absorbing the peace of the moment, watching the way Amina moved through her daily tasks, listening to the soft sounds of the wind rustling through the trees. There was no rush between them, no need for grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Their love existed in the quiet spaces, in the unspoken understanding that had grown between them over time. But as much as they tried to keep the world at bay, Kofi knew they couldn't live in isolation forever. The village would always be there, just beyond the edge of the savannah, with its rules, its traditions, and its judgments. There were still people in Kofi's life who hadn't come to terms with his relationship with Amina. His mother, for one. She had said little since their last conversation, but her silence spoke volumes. Kofi could feel the weight of her disappointment, though she tried to hide it behind polite smiles and brief exchanges. It was one of the many things that made this new beginning feel so fragile. Kofi knew that his choices had consequences, not just for himself, but for those around him. He defied the village's expectations, and while he didn't regret it, He also understood that the path he had chosen was not an easy one. The love he and Amina shared had grown in defiance of the world outside, but now, as they moved forward, they would have to find a way to exist within that world without losing themselves in it. Amina, for her part, seemed untroubled by these concerns. She had always been content to live on the outskirts of the village, both physically and metaphorically. She didn't need the approval of others, and she had long ago made peace with the fact that she was different from those around her. Her strength came from within, from the deep connection she had to the earth, to the natural rhythms of life. And now she had Kofi, a companion who understood her in a way that few others ever had. But Kofi couldn't ignore the village completely, no matter how much he wished he could. There were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, when the burden of carrying both his love for Amina and the expectations of the world outside became too much to bear. It was in those moments that Kofi leaned on Amina's quiet strength, drawing from her the resolve he needed to keep moving forward. They had found a kind of balance, a fragile equilibrium that allowed them to be together without completely severing their ties to the village. Kofi still visited his mother, still participated in the life of the community when necessary, but there was always a distance now, a sense that he no longer belonged fully to that world. His heart was elsewhere, with Amina, in the quiet refuge they had built together. As the days passed, this new beginning slowly began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of doubt, still days when the weight of the village's judgment felt heavier than usual. But Kofi had learned to push through those moments, to focus on the things that truly mattered. The love he shared with Amina, the peace he found in her presence, and the quiet joy that came from knowing he had made the right choice. Their love was delicate, like a young tree newly rooted in the soil. It would take time to grow, to strengthen, and to withstand the winds that would inevitably try to uproot it. But Kofi was willing to wait, willing to nurture what they had built together. He knew that love, true love, wasn't something that came easily. It was something that required patience, understanding, and, above all, resilience. And so, as the sun set on another day, casting a warm glow over the savannah, Kofi sat beside Amina, knowing that their journey was far from over. This was just the beginning, a fragile, precious beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that their love, though tested, had endured. And that, more than anything, gave Kofi the strength to keep moving forward, one quiet, steady step at a time.